I am gaming. I am gaming. I am gaming podcast.
Hey everybody, my name is Ivica. Thank you so much for being on the latest episode of I.Am Gaming podcast. This is a podcast about the gaming industry, entrepreneurship, gaming nostalgia, and many more cool things I find to be in the same realm of business and creative ventures. This is episode 103, and in this episode I'm going to talk science and technology and something I rarely cover in this podcast, which is global climate change and the technologies that can kind of help to steer it away from a total and utter disaster for humanity and maybe give us a fighting chance in turning our way of life around and making it less polluting. Before I get into that, a huge thanks goes to my Patreon supporters, and thank you so much for making this podcast possible. I really appreciate every buck you can spare, and I really appreciate sticking with me, which a lot of you have been doing for months and months. So please, everyone else, check out all of my Patreon supporters in the links in the description below. That will take you to all of my Patreon supporters, projects, Twitch streams, YouTube channels, games, and many more cool things. If you too would like to support me, please check out my Patreon page as well. Now, what is direct air carbon capture? It's basically a process of capturing carbon or CO2 from the atmospheric conditions anywhere on the planet. So instead of having filters or other systems that capture CO2 at the points where they're most heavily produced, like industrial complexes and so forth, these direct air capture facilities actually capture CO2 from the air we all breathe and try to eliminate the amounts of the same gas in the atmosphere through these basically industrial plants that of course run on renewable fuels or renewable energy sources, and thus eliminate or decrease the effect of CO2 in the atmosphere that is creating the greenhouse setup, which is basically heating up the world and messing up with our climate and our meteorological systems, creating ever stronger storms, issues like droughts, floods, and of course the global warming, which is melting the ice caps and raising the sea level. Now, direct air capture is, interestingly enough, a pretty sci-fi concept. You basically have your power plants that produce electricity for these carbon capture plants that then take out CO2 from the air, mix it with some other kind of material, and basically deposit it back into the earth in a form of a kind of a rocky goo and allow it to stay below ground instead of messing up everything above ground. Now, the problem here is that we already have carbon capture plants and facilities, and they're basically forests. Every plant uses CO2 and produces oxygen, and they're basically capturing CO2 as well. However, the concept of power plants is that they can do that, or to allow direct air capture plants through renewable power plants like solar or wind, to do that on a much larger scale. So for example, a single factory could do the work of many acres of forests and do it on a much steadier, more linear path. Also, there could be options to extend their usage, expand the amount of capture they can produce, and so forth. However, people believe often that this will not be a solution for climate change in its total, which is completely true, it won't. But I believe that it has to be a part of the overall solution. These plants need to appear all over the world and do their part in basically siphoning out CO2 from the atmosphere. That's not easy, that's not cheap, that's not something that we can do in a year or two. It will take a lot longer than that, and the technology needs to get better and better and better. However, right now, a few months ago, a first major facility that is doing that began working in Iceland, which is a huge step, and it basically took the global potential of carbon capture up by something like 40%, a single factory. Now, it's still a really tiny amount. They siphon all of those factories for direct air capture, siphon like something like 10 seconds of global production of CO2 per year, and that's really a small amount. However, my hope is that these will grow and get better and better and better. A big part of that, in my view, needs to be a global consent and a global understanding that we need to get informed about this. I believe that I can help with that in the coming weeks and months, on a small scale, of course, but I can influence and do my part in the broader mission, let's say it like that, of everyone, to get everyone else informed about the importance of all of these tools in the fight against global climate change, with, I believe, with absolute certainty that direct air capture of CO2 is one of them. So I will begin a small project that will hopefully create something which will, in a small, tiny, minuscule way, help out the overall process of direct air carbon capture in the coming months, but more precisely years and even decades. So it's a small project I'm starting. I can't share anything else right now, but it will hopefully grow into something tiny but relevant and useful, especially in that regard of helping educate and more precisely inform people about this on a really grassroots, really non-overly scientific, non-overly technical way, but instead kind of presenting the same thing to people so that they can get, first of all, interested in this, and then through their means and options and abilities support it indirectly or directly, however they can. So yep, I'm going to do something about direct air capture of CO2. Hopefully it's going to be interesting. I'm going to do an episode about it when it's all done and ready, which could be in a couple of months from now when I look at it realistically, but hopefully you will be here to check it out with me. That's all for episode 103. Thank you so much for listening. I'm still a bit rough when it comes to my voice. I had a cold and it devastating my vocal cords, but they're getting better, but they're still not completely back online and operational as much as I would want them to be. That's all for me. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of I'm Gaming Podcast. Thank you for being interested in global climate change and how can we help in that reversion of the same process. And yeah, hope I see you on my next episode. Until then, thanks so much for listening and have a great week. Bye bye.